afternoon, class. My name is Owuson Ponsan, and I'm doing this presentation on behalf of my senior colleague, Dr. Rudolph King. We are walking you through social science research and data analysis, which is a third unit in the research methods. And this is the order of presentation. I'll start off by giving a snapshot of the differences between research conducted in the natural sciences and the research conducted in the social sciences. And then I'll also ask you maybe to rhetorically to indicate the significance of you, somebody having a natural science background, having to be familiar with social science research methodologies. And then after having discussed two major techniques in the social science research, viz. The survey research and then case study research, I'll go on to discuss the research ethics and then conclude. In the natural sciences, some models can be used to represent reality, and for that reason there is a flexibility of using models to, just dealing with the models, hoping that with the try and errors we will be able to find a solution to an identified problem. But that flexibility, it's not so in the social sciences. In the social sciences, human beings or the human society, it's the laboratory of the social research. Unlike you in the natural sciences, which you have labs, physical laboratories that you can go and undertake a lot of experiments, hoping that you'll be able to find a solution to an identified problem. The social sciences, we don't have that luxury. And so there is a need for us to, through a systematic and robust approach, deal with the human being in his unpredictability manner in order to be able to find solutions to development problems in the social science. So what I'm saying in effect is that the basic difference between research conducted in the natural sciences and that's conducted in the social sciences, the flexibility associated with research in the natural sciences vis-a-vis the unpredictability of the human being in a society. The purpose of this unit is to introduce you participants to the empirical social science research, which involves the design of data collection instruments and then collection, management, simulation, analysis, and presentation of data. But I must be very quick to add that even before we design the data collection instruments, there are so many other activities that we have to undertake before we can be able to design an appropriate data collection instrument to gather the responses that we need to answer our research questions. So in this unit, participating students are supposed to be able to identify some of the research approaches available to researchers in the social sciences. And so what I want to say is that after the session, if we are not familiar with some of the research techniques adopted in the social science, then we will say the session has not been very effective. Again, we can measure the effectiveness of the session by examining ourselves on the extent to which we know the factors that affect the effectiveness of the research approaches that are adopted by the social scientists. We also have to know how to operationalize these research approaches in ways that the weaknesses do not limit the credibility of the research findings. So in today's session, I'm walking the class through two of the approaches in the social sciences. The first approach is the survey research, and the second is a case study. And I expect that at the end of the session, we will be able to draw a very thick line of distinction between the survey research and the case study research. I start off by defining a survey research. And so on the slide showing, on slide 8, we have survey research defined. And I say that a survey research is a systematic method of collecting data from a population of interest. If I had ended here, I think the question you would have asked me is all the other research methodologies, be it in the natural sciences or in the social science, also follows a systematic approach in collecting the data that we need for analysis. So then what makes a survey research different from, for example, a case study? So I decided to add this. Surveys tend to be quantitative in nature and usually uses structured and standardized questionnaire. The explanation here is that the survey tends to use figures. For example, 20%, 90% of the respondents, 60% of the respondents. These are expressions that are usually used by researchers that adopt the survey research. And then in collecting these quantitative data, we also make use of structured and standardized questionnaires. As the lecture unfolds, you will come to understand the difference between structured questionnaires and structured questionnaires, semi-structured questionnaires, just to mention but some few. The survey research also aims to collect information from a sample within a certain degree of error. Please, let's try and understand this. It aims to collect information from a sample within a certain degree of error. A certain degree of error implying that the units that we are selecting for the study will not be the entire unit. That is a complete enumeration, which is called a census. So because of that, time will not even allow us to do a complete census or a complete enumeration. So because of that, there is every need for us to select a portion of the total population, hoping that the findings that we come up with will be used to generalize, we will generalize the findings to represent the whole. But we can do this based on a certain degree of confidence. So the degree of confidence can be 90%. So if we say that 20% of the people prefer to use LPG, then that finding is accepted based on, it's 90% accepted. If we decide to use 95% confidence level, then we say that the finding that 20% of the respondents prefer to use LPG can be accepted based on a 95% confidence. That is the rule. And then here there are several schools of thoughts about the sample that we need, the total number of units that we need to do a research in order to be able to generalize our findings. Some say only 30 units can be selected, interviewed, and the findings can be generalized to represent the whole. Others say no, it's supposed to be based on a confidence level of between 90 and 99%. Others say, if it is 80%, it's acceptable. The focus of the lecture today is not to explain the nuances associated with the number of units that we need to do a research, but is to draw home the arguments that there is the need for us to have the sample size in mind. But this sample size, the findings should be such that it will, to a large extent, be generalized to represent the whole of the units. So, on the survey research, today's session I'm walking you through 12 steps that we use in conducting a survey research. And then I expect that at the end of the session you will understand in detail why there is a need for us to go through this rigor in eliciting the required responses to answer our research objectives. The first is we should clarify the purpose of the research. I will on the following slides explain what we mean to clarify the purpose of the research. But we go on to resource assessment. The third step is to take a decision on the methods and procedures to use. The fourth step is to design the questionnaire. The fifth, pilot test the questionnaires that have been designed. The sixth is to prepare a sample. You will know what goes into the preparation of the sample. You also consider the need to train interviewers to be able to gather the right responses from the field for the right analysis to be done. We will then go to discuss data collection. We will need to also process the data after the data collection. We will then go on to analyze how we can analyze the results, interpret and disseminate the results, and then take action that is needed to, for example, address any identified problem. Also can be action that is needed to implement recommendations that are made after the report has been disseminated. So I start off by explaining in detail each of the 12 steps in a survey research, and I pray for your rapt attention. First is to clarify the purpose of the research, as has already been emphasized on the preceding slide. Here, it spells out the reason for conducting the research. I think it's a common knowledge that every research will have a reason why it is undertaken, and that can be identified easily from the goals and objectives of the research. So we have to clarify, why are we doing this research? Why are we to, for example, understand people's preference for the various typology of energy services for cooking, for example? So we need to spell out clearly the reasons for conducting the research. Still, in clarifying the purpose of the research, it is necessary because clarity of the research purpose helps to know if the survey is the most appropriate approach to use. In the introduction, I did indicate that there are so many approaches that can be used in investigating a phenomenon in the social science, and I'm pretty sure that the same story can be told of research in the natural sciences. So in clarifying the purpose of the research, it helps you to answer this question: is the survey process the most appropriate technique or the most appropriate methodology to use to elicit the required responses to answer my research questions? If the answer is no, then it means that we will have to consider other more appropriate research methodologies. But if the answer is yes, then it means that the survey research will have to be undertaken. And then in no time we will understand in detail what we mean by if the answer is yes, if the answer is no. But let me go to the next stage. The next stage is resource assessment. Here I will say it's one of the very critical stages in conducting a successful survey. I will say this with one practical experience from a just ended UNDP survey undertaken by the Energy Center of the College of Engineering, KNUST. The total budget of the project was $29,300. That was the budget that was approved for the survey. But in the proposal, we had earmarked 51 communities from the 10 administrative regions in the Republic of Ghana for that research. When the coordinator was asked to present the budget for just the survey, just the data collection, which is one of the stages of the survey process, it came to light that we needed to spend $43,000 on just the data collection alone. So the point I'm emphasizing here is that if we had not done a resource assessment, we would have begun the data collection exercise and landed on a rock, an impermeable rock, because we wouldn't have resources to continue to implement the survey. So when we did the resource assessment and realized that even the data collection alone required $43,000, which was almost 2 times the budget line for the survey, there was the need for us to replan. And so instead of 10 regions, we selected 3 regions. One from the northern part of the country, one from the middle belt, and one from the coastal belt. Instead of 51 communities, it was scaled down to only 15 communities. And then the $29,300 that was earmarked for the survey was able to, we were able to use that amount to execute successfully the survey. So the point I'm emphasizing here is that resource assessment, it's one of the vital steps in the survey research. And as a matter of fact, it is also a step in all the other research works that we do. Financing is the bridge to implementing our proposals. If we don't have enough funds, we will not be able to execute most of the things that we conceptualize implementing. Another example can be cited of the Ghana Vision 2020. That was a long-term development plan to usher the Republic of Ghana into a middle-income economy by 2020. When an assessment was done, it came to light that there were so many projects that, there were so many programs that were earmarked for implementation, but the planners did not know where the resources would come from for the execution of that. And so it's accounted for, it served as one of the reasons why the Ghana Vision 2020 made way for the Ghana Poverty Reduction Strategy to be introduced. So what specifically do we look out for in the step 2, which is the resource assessment? Here, we have to do an in-house resource assessment to design a survey that is within the budget line. And the experience from the Energy Center supports this or elucidates this point better. We also know which resources we need to contract out. It's possible that the center may need a certain tool to analyze certain data, but it may not have the expertise. So we will need to there is a need for us to contract somebody from outside to come and help us do that research work. It's also possible that we may need some logistics, but the logistics, we don't have them in stock. So we will have to contract them, we contract out, and then we carry out the research. The resource assessment should also look at the staff availability and skills, and the logistics, as I've already explained. And then here, another example is the fact that the Energy Center of the College of Engineering also did another survey in Ghana. And then the intention was to make available to the Global Energy Assessment some data for global energy assessments done by the UNDP. And then the tool that they used was called LEAP. LEAP, the Energy Center did not have the expertise. So what the Energy Center had to do was to contract somebody from outside, an expatriate, to come and walk them through how to use the tool. And then eventually they were able to apply the LEAP to carry out the research. So I say once more that resource assessment being the second step in the detailed survey research, it's very, very important and then glozing over this will have adverse ramifications for the success of the research. The third stage is to decide on the methods and procedures to use. The questions I have here: should the process be face-to-face interview? That is the process of gathering the information from the respondents or the units. Should it be through a face-to-face interviews? Should it be mailed and emailed questionnaires? And then should it be done via telephone or computerized telephone interviews? Each of these have some determinants or some factors that affect them. For example, with a face-to-face interview, one of the criticisms is that it's expensive because you will have to train people how to organize a successful interview. They go to the field and then make sure that they lay hands on all the respondents and then grant interview. It's also time consuming. But the strength is that the non-response rate tends to be lower when you adopt the face-to-face interview. The other point is that even if there are non-responses, the interviewer or the researcher is able to identify the reasons why people, for example, refused to answer the whole questionnaire. And then another instance can be why people decided not to answer some of the questions in the instrument. So that's the strength of the face-to-face interview. And if you have the resources, then there is every need to conduct a face-to-face interview. With a mailed and emailed questionnaire, it's always very convenient. You will just sit by your computer as I'm doing here. If I have the email addresses of the respondents, I'll just send the questionnaires to them, expecting that they will be able to fill. The disadvantage or the weakness here is that those of us located in the developing world where literacy rate is slow, where technological advancement is also low, not everybody has an email address. Even in my class, I didn't want to use pen drives because it was one of the media for virus transmission. So I decided to send my materials to my students after the session. You know what was interesting is that most of the students did not have email addresses. Of course, they had Facebook addresses, but they didn't have email addresses. So because I was using that approach and was not ready to give them hard copies of whatever I delivered in class, they were compelled to go and open accounts. The irony of the situation is that because I was forcing them to give me the email addresses, some of them even came with email addresses that did not exist. They just wrote, for example, amponsan2009 at yahoo.com. You send the information and it comes back to you after some time as a mailer demon or a failure delivery. So the point I'm driving home is that even those of us in the academic environment, those of us who claim to be enlightened, we don't have email addresses. And then the other limitation is that somebody can see it's mailed into his account and can ignore, can decide not to answer, can decide not to participate in that. The limitation is that you, the researcher, will not be able to know why the respondent decided not to respond to the questions. So fine, you will be able to calculate the non-response rates, but you will not be able to assign a reason why people chose not to respond. What about our brothers who live in the rural areas, the remote areas that are not connected to even the grid? How much more having an internet access? It becomes pretty difficult to use such an approach in those areas. We can also adapt the telephone and computerized telephone interviews. The computerized telephone interviews can be via Skype. It can be via any other media. But the point is that just as the mailed and emailed questionnaires may not yield reasons why people, for example, refuse to answer some of the questionnaires. The telephone and computerized interviews will also be difficult operationalizing in our part of the world where several people do not even have access to a telephone, and several other people do not even know how to use a computerized telephone interviews. So we don't have the luxury to implement all these things. I mean, all the mailed and emailed questionnaires and the telephone and computerized interviews. But what I will say is that this lecture that I've given, it's telling us some of the factors that affect the operationalization of the approaches or the procedures that I have listed here. So what we need to do is that in the third stage, decision on the methods to use, we have to consider the environment. We have to do a careful analysis. We have to do a careful scan of the environment and see which of the approaches can best yield the responses that we need. If you don't get that, then if you don't do that, we will decide to use one approach, and then eventually we realize that another approach could have been better than the other. The fourth stage is to design the questionnaire. By now we understand that it's a common knowledge to design a questionnaire along the objectives of the research. If you don't do that, my students, most of them come with voluminous questionnaires. And when I make time and go through, I see that some of the questions do not even address any of their research questions. So I ask, for example, Eric, what is the relevance of this question in the questionnaire? And it takes them 30 minutes to even explain. And then what I eventually gather is that they speak in English instead of trying to explain to me the significance of the questions in the questionnaire. So the strategy has been that if you have 4 objectives or 4 research questions, then recast the research questions in the form of subheadings and then start asking questions maybe from 1 to 10 or from 1 to 20 under that. And then in that case you will be able to verify the appropriateness or otherwise of each of the questions put in the questionnaire. There is also the need for us to be familiar with some guidelines in designing the research questionnaire. First, we have to look at language or wording. The language wording is very, very important. Those of you who are mechanical engineers, you can use a technical jargon, which is not common knowledge. So if you put in words that are understood by the technical men in the field, but are not understood by the people that you are interviewing, it makes it very difficult for them to appropriately respond to the questions that you are asking them. The other thing is that if you are not very careful with the language wording, it will lead to what we call garbage in, garbage out, because they have not understood it. They will write everything or anything that comes to mind, they will write down. And then when you sit down and you want to make meaning out of the responses that you have gathered from the crowd, then you see they did not understand the import of the question. And so the responses that have been gathered are garbage. So we have to be very careful with the wording. Let's be very simple. Let's work with the principle, simple is beauty. And then if there is even the need for us to explain any technical term that has been used, then we take our time and do that, hoping that our audience, our respondents, will be able to understand it and then give us the appropriate response that we need. There is another important note we have to take. It's the recall bias in designing the questionnaire. Recall bias. With the recall bias, what we do is that some will say, oh, can I ask you a question? Why don't you like LPG. Meanwhile, you have not asked whether, you have not even sought his preference about cooking fuels. But you start by asking, why don't you like LPG? Don't you think that chastising politicians who indulge in politics of insult is right? If you do that, you have already unveiled your bias, which is not correct in a research. A researcher should, as much as possible and practicable, be neutral. So you ask, instead of, don't you think that there is a need for us to chastise politicians who indulge in politics of insult? You can say, what do you think about the current political landscape? And then you ask other follow-up questions to enable the respondent to give you his thoughts about what we should do about the situation. For example, the respondent may even like the political landscape, the being characterized with politics of insults. The man may even like it. But if you start, what do you think we should do? Then it means that you have already said that it's wrong. And so, if you're not careful, he can decide either not to give you the response that you need, or can decide, because he knows the direction you are driving at, he will decide to give you what you think it's the answer. Meanwhile, that person might have biased or might have said something that is not the reality. The other thing we have to look out in designing a questionnaire is the order of the questions. The order of the questions. What I will say here, as a practical example, is the UNDP survey that was conducted in the 3 regions in Ghana. I personally administered a questionnaire in one of the small towns in the Ashanti region. Ashanti region, for the sake of our international audience, Ashanti region is one of the administrative regions in the Republic of Ghana. And then when I went to this small community called Efijase, I happened to be interviewing a household head who was not ready because he did not have enough time. He was leaving for the farm. So he said that, my brother, you ask me the questions and then I'll see if I can answer them. And then I'll allow my wife to continue, because it's also the next to the head in the household, so the next of kin. So I started asking questions about income and expenditure, because I felt that with the income, he was the right person to give me the information I needed. And then the other expenses, the other information that we needed about the energy that they use could easily be given by the next of kin, which is the wife or the spouse. To my surprise, because I began the questions with the income, the man first questioned, but he said you were interested in energy. Why are you asking about income and expenditure? Class, there was not a word I could use to persuade this man to grant the interview. As a matter of fact, I could not grant the interview, and it became a non-response, because he said that there was no way he was going to give me that information. The question he asked me, do you know, he saw me to be a young man, are you ready to disclose to another person how much you are paid at the end of every month, for example, for the work you do as a lecturer? I was quiet. Are you ready to tell me how much, for example, you spend on food? His fear was that we will go and disclose that information, which is supposed to be personal, to other people living in the same neighborhood, and then personal issues will become public. So he was not ready. But the point I'm making here is that if I had enough time to have begun the process or the questionnaire administration with the energy information that was the basis of the introduction, then after some time you would have been able to establish a rapport, and then would have easily gathered the information with regards to income and expenditure. But because he was in a haste, we were not able to do that. So viewers, let us learn lessons from this, that it's better to always begin with a very simple questions that are not too much probing. What I mean is that they do not require private responses or personal responses. What kind of energy do you use for lighting? That is something that is not too sensitive. So you can easily get a response in that regard or to that question. But if you go ask income and expenditure first, you are likely going to land on a rock. So please, let's be very careful. The other thing here is that please forgive me if I am burdening you with a lot of personal experiences. The intention is not to show off, but the intention is to edify the class about the do's and don'ts in designing a questionnaire. The last point we showed, probably the last point we showed, not lose sight of, is the length of the questionnaire. The length of the questionnaire. With the length of the questionnaire, some survey works require an enumerator to spend about 3 hours, 4 hours with a respondent. Will you be ready? Yes, you are enlightened, but will you be ready to sit down with another person who comes, for example, from the national capital, comes to you, tells you that you are somebody he selected, and then he should grant an interview. You sit down for 4 hours. Even 1 hour, it's too much. He may not be ready. He may not be ready. Time is money. So he may not be ready to grant the interview. So in that case, what will you do? If the questionnaire is voluminous, about 20 pages, and then some of the questions are even probing ones, it requires that you write down the responses. In that case, you will likely spend about 3 hours with one enumerator. What will you do? This is a question, a genuine question, because it comes up. I participated in another research by the Millennium Villages Project in the Ashanti region, Ghana. And then the questionnaire was very voluminous. You needed no less than 3 hours to interview one respondent. And so we were required not to even administer more than 3 questionnaires a day. In that case, what will you do? The woman or the man you are interviewing is a farmer. Unfortunately, when they're during the rainy season, he has to leave for the farm, or she has to leave for the farm. What will you do? Let me tell you what we did. And then you reconcile what I'll tell you with the answer you had on mind. You can break the questionnaire into several phases. The first phase, about 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and you book another appointment. In the second phase, you book another appointment so you exhaust the instrument. The intention is that not only will he not be ready to grant the interview, but the other thing is that when he is fatigued and he wants you to leave, he will corrupt the research work by telling you answers that are not quite correct because he is exasperated. Sometimes they see you as somebody coming from, if it's a rural survey, they see you as somebody coming from the national capital or the regional capital, somebody coming from the university. So you are seen to be in a different world, and because of that you are respected. So if you are taking too much of his time, he will not complain. But he has a subtle way of registering a protest. But if you are not careful, you are not well experienced, you are not experienced enough, you will not be able to identify this. So viewers, what I'm saying is that the length of the questionnaire, or more importantly, the time you spend with one respondent in administering a questionnaire is something very, very critical. And then the normal thing has been between 15 and 20 minutes. But there are some genuine instances where it will travel beyond this. But the respondent should be ready to grant the interview. And then all these that we're talking about, for example, the length of the research, we should not, as we undertake the research, we should not be too rigid. We should be friendly. We should be creating some sense of humor, right? As we do that, even if you spend 1 hour with him, he may not even know that you have spent 1 hour. Sometimes when you do the interview and you tell them, oh, I'm done, thank you very much, they'll be surprised. Oh, but I thought you were going to ask this. I thought you were going to ask this. I'm ready to answer all 3 questions. Some even go ahead to tell you a lot of the problems they are facing, hoping that you can come and address the problems for them. That is after you have established a very good rapport with your respondents and they also have confidence in the process. Let's look at some types of questions that we can use in a questionnaire. We have here what we call structured questionnaires. Please, this is a rhetorical question because this is recorded. I would have asked you what structured questions are, what unstructured questions are, what contingency questions are, and what matrix questions are. But because there is no direct interface, I will not be able to ask that question. Fortunately for us, when we're doing the online chat session, I asked this question, and the responses I gathered were satisfactory. But to elucidate more the discussion that we had about 3 weeks ago, the structured questions are questions with coded responses. Responses that the respondents will have to choose from. It's just like those of us in the universities. It's just like the multiple choice questions that we are given at the end of the semester. There, the options 1 and the options A to E, you are supposed to choose from the options given. That is the structured questions. With unstructured questions, the question can be asked. For example, let me give an example of the structured question. We can ask you, which of the following energy services do you require for lighting? You can ask LPG. Of course, LPG these days is used for lighting. You can ask grid connected electricity. You can ask solar energy as the 3, and then the respondent is supposed to select 1 or 2 in some instances, or even all the 3, and then indicate the preference. But with unstructured questions, we can say, which energy service do you require for lighting? And then we leave a space to record the answer. So that's basically the difference. With a structured, questions are provided, options are provided. With unstructured questions, no option is provided. The respondent has the luxury to write his own response and not to select from some options that are given. With the contingency questions, some questions do not apply to certain groups. For example, we can ask you, what is your educational level? And say tertiary. Then the questions that follow, we can say, if it is tertiary, please answer the following questions. So, if you don't have a tertiary educational level, you are not supposed to answer the questions that will follow. That kind of questions is called contingency questions. We also have matrix questions. With the matrix questions, we tend to use what we call the Likert skill in gathering the responses that we need. For example, tell us your level of preference with LPG usage as a cooking fuel. With LPG usage as a cooking fuel. And we can ask, oh, the preference, we can start from 0 up to 5. 0 is, oh, indifference. 1, it's like it to a certain degree. Up to 5. So 5 will be most preferred. And then 1 will be the least preferred. We can also have another Likert scale calibrated from 2, 1, 0, -1, -2. And if we want you to tell us your perception, for example, about the use of candle as an indoor lighting, for indoor lighting, we can say 2, most preferred, 1, preferred, 0, neutral, -1, not preferred, -2, maybe very dissatisfied. So this is the skill that we use in the matrix questions. And then it's supposed to bring out the nuances associated with preferences or with some options or some responses that we gather from the thought. Before we go on, there is this question I always ask my students when I'm given an opportunity to walk them through the survey research. The question I ask is, we have the structured questions. The structured questions. We want to go to the field with the structured questions. The strength is that it facilitates the data analysis. Data analysis when we come from the field and we have structured responses. It's a matter of just coding them and then entering into any software and generating the statistics that we need. Remember, the survey research is largely quantitative in nature. So how then can we ensure that the options given in the structured questionnaires are exhaustive? That is to say that respondents will not have several options to give, but these options are not captured by the instruments we seek to administer. How do we ensure that the options we provide in a structured questionnaire are exhaustive? I know some of you are telling yourself a lot of options, a lot of responses. But I would say first is that we should do a pilot test of the questionnaires. We will come to the pilot test of the questionnaires. But when we do a pilot test of the questionnaire in a similar situation, we will be able to identify the likely responses. But if our responses are not exhaustive enough, then it's better we go for unstructured questionnaires. With unstructured questionnaires, it is very difficult analyzing the data when you gather from the field, because some will say this girl is 20 years old. Another person will say, oh, he just turned 20 years old. What are we saying? We are saying that the girl is 20 years old. Or we have lived here for 20 years. Another person will say, oh, we came here in the year 1992. So what you need to do as a researcher is to sit down, go through all these options that come. That is under the unstructured questionnaires. And you try to make meaning out of all these responses. Assuming you interviewed 2,651 respondents, as the Energy Center did in the UNDP survey? Will you be able to have time to go through all these responses, rewrite them into a uniform format before you start the analysis? Some will say, oh, it will be tedious, especially if you have a questionnaire of 20 pages, as we used 20 pages. So it's practically impossible within a short period to do this, unless you bring on board several other people, and that even makes the process more complex. So what we need to do is, with the structured questionnaires, we can pre-test the instruments, and then with the pre-testing we will be able to get responses that otherwise we will not have considered if we were just to code the responses and go to the plot. The other thing that most researchers use is when the options are given A to E, F will be other. So other will be the option, and they will say please specify, implying that if the respondent has any other option that is not captured within the options given, the other will be able to address it. And then as we do the data entry, the other, another option can be created for it to be included in what we do. So what I'm trying to say in effect is that whether we go for structured questions, unstructured questions, or any other form of questions, there are pros and cons. So we have to assess the pros and cons and then juxtapose that on what we seek to do, and then do the right thing. Else garbage in, garbage out. Now I've said that one of the ways of ensuring that the responses provided in the instruments are exhaustive is to do a pilot test. That's just one reason why there is a need for us to do a pilot test. But on this slide, the loaded slide, let us look at some of the other reasons why there is a need for us to do a pilot test. Some say a pilot survey. Others say preliminary survey, reconnaissance survey. They are used interchangeably. But pilots, let's test the instruments that we have prepared. And there are so many reasons why we do that. First, know if each question addresses the research question. Each question addresses the research question. We go to the front, we ask some people who are likely going to be our respondents in the final survey. We ask them, the responses they give, are they answering our research questions? If not, then we will have to go back to our closets and do the right thing. If yes, then it means that it's marked correct. So we are on the right path. Let's go to the second. Know if the questions are interpreted in a similar vein by enumerators and respondents. This is basic. And this is one of the very good reasons why we need to do a pilot test. The UNDP research, 2,651 respondents were interviewed, or household heads were interviewed. The average size of the research team was 30. 30 enumerators were trained and then detailed to the field to go and collect the data. So if we don't make sure that everybody is interpreting the questions in a similar way, then the responses that we will gather will be based on somebody's interpretation of a question to a respondent. And then the answer that he also gives will be based on his comprehension of what has been communicated to him. So what I'm trying to say is that in effect, the responses that we will get will be different from one another, and that will derail the research process. So what we need to do is to ensure that the responses are interpreted in a similar way, and then the respondents also understand the interpretation in a uniform way or in a similar way. If they don't understand, I've already explained that the responses they will give will vary from what we expect. Sorry, from what we expect. How do we ensure that the understanding of the numerator and the respondents about the question, the import of the question, it's correct? We can do that based on the responses that we get. Based on the responses that we get. Sometimes the answer a respondent gives is out of gear. You just look at the question that was asked and the response that has been written down. So no, this is out of gear. It is out of gear. And we can easily identify that in the unstructured questions. It is out of gear. And then you can call the numerator to come and explain to you how the question was asked. And then by so doing, you will identify that it's either he did not understand it or the respondents did not understand it. And you will have to take some measures to address such a problem. We also need to identify if options provided for close-ended questions are exhaustive. I've already explained this, so there is no need to belabor this point. We do a pilot test to also assess clarity and understandability of the questions. Clarity. Are the questions clear to both the enumerator and the respondent? I've already explained that it's very, very important. It's vital for the success of the research. We also evaluate the time taken to administer a questionnaire. In a pilot test, you note the time you began the research, the administration, and the time you ended. And so you will be able to do a fair assessment of the time you need to complete one instrument. Remember that we have just explained on one of the slides that if the questionnaire is voluminous and requires a long time to administer, it sometimes defeats the purpose of the research. If the researcher or the enumerator does not have the requisite skills to sustain the momentum he begins with. In that case, this stage of the survey process will be able to tell us that Amposa or Sami or Eric, you need 3 hours to be able to administer this instrument. And so there is a need, since some of the questions cannot be dropped, cannot be crossed out, there is every need to compartmentalize the survey into phases, or the data collection exercise into phases, so that you will not be creating boredomness. If you do that, it's to the peril of the research. You also know respondents' reaction to some of the questions. Respondents' reaction to some of the questions. Fortunately for us, in the UNDP survey, it was in 2011. So we did not get a lot of people attempting to link the survey objective to politics. But in the year 2004, we did another survey that was for the preparation of district medium-term development plans for the Bebiani and Riaso Bekwai districts. And with this survey, in the previous year, the governments of Ghana had registered the unemployed. So the impression was that they were going to get jobs. But in the year 2004, when they had not been given the jobs that they needed, people felt that because we were in an election year, we came again with the instruments to camouflage. We camouflaged ourselves as researchers, and then we wanted to come and then maybe tell them that we still have their interests at heart, and then we were going to make sure that they get the jobs. So it was pretty difficult persuading a household head who was a unit of analysis to grant the interview. Because they say that every day you come here, every day you come here, we've not seen any improvement in our lives. So such reactions, some of them will even go to the extent of asking you to go away because they are not ready. You are not going to do anything for them. So such reactions are necessary because the enumerator will arm himself before he sets off to the field. In the natural sciences, because, for example, in the medicine, we are using the rabbits, we will not need to know the reactions, for example. And then perhaps we may be interested in the reactions after we administer some dosage. We just observe. If it dies, it dies. If it does not die and respond perfectly to the injection, then we say it's fine. But that is not so in the social sciences. We have to know the reactions. Another one we did in East Legon. East Legon is one of the affluent communities in the Republic of Ghana for the sake of the international audience. It's one of the affluent areas in the Republic of Ghana. Our enumerators had to undergo a lot of security checks before they were even allowed the entry into the premises. Some of them will ask you, Amponsa, what do you want? After you have mentioned your name, you have introduced yourself to the prospective respondent. They'll tell you, Amponsa, what do you want here? You will explain the survey intent. I will tell you, oh, sorry, I'm asleep. I can't answer. So go and come back some other time. So these are some of the reasons why there is a need for us to pilot test the questionnaire, so that when we go with our ammunitions, we will not get disappointed. The C stage is the preparation of the sample. Preparation of the sample. Remember that we have said that the sample is just a proportion or a portion of the population. And so we need to ensure that the sample is such that the intention to generalize the responses to represent the entire population is not compromised upon. And there is a need for us to go through a rigorous process in selecting the units. So the questions that we should be guided by include how many people will be included. How many people will be included? How many people do we want to select? That is the sample size. How will the survey respondents be selected? So, for example, if you say we want to interview 2,651 household heads, how will we select these household heads? Do we select anybody we come across? Do we have any other ways that we can use to select the household heads? We will discuss that later. But in determining the sample size, let's look at some of the relevant questions we need to consider. What is the size of your target population? For example, you have come to KNUST, you want to select some students for a research. The question you should ask yourself is how many students, what is the student population on KNUST campus? That is telling you the size of the target population. If it's 22,000, then the target population is 22,000. Before we can go ahead to determine a sample size based on an acceptable level of confidence or significant level. What can the budget allow? This is also another important question we should be asking, or we should be guided with. What can the budget allow? Remember, everything that we do is subject to the budget constraints. The UNDP survey that I keep on referring you to, we would have interviewed about 5,000 households from 51 communities, from the 10 administrative regions. Unfortunately, we were not able to do that because the budget line was too limited, $29,300. So we had to work within this budget, but not compromising on the need to generalize our findings to represent the whole. And then we come to the next question guiding question. How confident do you need the results to be? Should it be 99%? Should it be 98%? You will have to tell us. And then all these will have to be based on the budget line, or how much the budget will allow. Do you need to also look at any subgroups? This is very, very important. If there are subgroups that will likely give different responses, if you're not careful and you don't take cognizance of this, you will underrepresent such group, and then the survey process, the results will not be credible for a generalization. So for example, do we need to represent first year students in KNUST? If we need to represent them much as we need to represent the second, third and final year students, even postgraduate students, then we need to make sure that such group is represented. And how do we do that? We walk through the process. So here in the step 6, there are two things. How to determine the sample size, which are guided by these questions that we have. What is the size of your target population? What can the budget allow? How confident do you need to be with the results? And do you need to look at any subgroups? These questions are guiding you in determining an appropriate sample size. The sample size is most often determined scientifically or statistically. Why do you say 30? That's the question I keep on asking my students, and I have one report here that I'm marking. The researcher interviewed 22 clients of HFC, the Home Finance Company Limited, regarding the administration of mortgage loans for housing construction. So the question I asked, Dorcas, why did you interview 22 clients of the HFC? Then she will have to come and explain how she arrived at the 22, and I will be convinced if she's able to tell me the sampling frame or the total number of units that she was supposed to select from, and how she determined the sample size. So what I'm saying is that most often than not, we determine the sample size statistically, and then I'm very comfortable using the Miller and Brewer 2003 model here. Let me give you the source. It's A to D of the social science. It's by Miller and Brewer 2003. And this is what we are showing on slide 17. Sorry. Here, the small n is the sample size that we want. And then the capital N or the big N is the sample frame. The sample frame being the total population we need to select units from. So that is a sample frame. And the sample size will be the portion of the total population that we need to use for the research. 1 is a constant. And then alpha, it's the level, the error margin. The error margin, please get this understanding. If the significant level is 99%, then the error margin is 1%. If it is 90%, the error margin is 10%. It's 10%. 10%. Please get that. So let's work with this. Assuming that the population of households is 10,000, and then we evaluate the figures into the model that we have here at 95% confidence level, then it gives us 385 students, assuming we have 10,000 students to deal with. It becomes 10,000 over 1 plus 10,000 in bracket 0.05 squared. Please note that the 0.05 squared is the error margin for 95% significance level. And why is it 0.05 and not 5? Remember that I was using the body language. 5%. 5% is the same as 5 over 100. And it's the same as 0.05. I think it's basic. We understand that. So when we simplify, we get 384.6. What is 0.6 of a human being? We don't have. So we run it up to 385, implying that we need only 385 students out of a population of 10,000 students to do a research, and the findings will be 95% significant. Now, after we have identified the sample size, here we want to interview 385 students. Then how do we select the units? That's also very critical. Much as the sample size is very important, viewers, we have to understand that the sampling method is equally important so that we will not compromise the research. And there are two ways, two main ambits, two main sampling techniques. You have probability sampling and non-probability sampling. Those, because our background is the natural sciences, probability and non-probability, I'm not so sure I will have a burden explaining. With a probability sampling, I would say that every unit has an equal and non-zero chance of being represented in a sample. Let me be very simple. The 10,000 students on campus, if we want to use any probability sampling technique, then every member of the 10,000 can be selected, can be represented in the sample size of 385. But with the non-probability, some are ignored and then we focus on others. So what it means is that not everybody has a chance of being represented in a sample. But with the probability, every unit within the population has an equal and non-zero chance of being represented. Please, let's look at, in brief, let's look at some of the probability sampling techniques, non-probability sampling technique. Here, I want to say that this session requires about 6 hours of lectures, probability sampling, non-probability sampling. I can even do this lecture effectively in a semester because it's very broad. We have to know how we operationalize this, the factors that affect this. So I want you to complement what you gather from this session with what it's prepared for you in the course materials. Of course, you also have to support the knowledge that you get with others that you get from elsewhere. And we have a lot of research methodology books in circulation. The first probability sampling technique I want to discuss here is the random sampling. The random sampling. Some call it the simple random sampling technique. With a simple random sampling technique, we have all the units. We know them. So we have numbered them 1, 2, 3. And then we keep them. This is the lottery method I'm explaining. We keep them in a basket. We need only 2. So we shuffle them and then we pick one randomly. We pick another one, another random. So we leave this one out. Remember that this could have been picked and not that. That gives them the equal and non-zero chance of being represented. So we picked this, we said, oh, we have to go to Desmond. We have picked this, we have to go to Amponsan. And then we have left this one out. Right? This is the simple random sampling lottery method. The other one could be lottery method with replacements. Here we keep them there, and then we have the three. So we pick one we want to replace with a blank sheet. We pick another so that everybody will have an equal chance of being represented. So viewers, what I'm trying to say in effect is that even under the simple random sampling, there are so many techniques that we can operationalize. But the point is that every unit has an equal chance of being represented. And then we have to know the units, keep them or assign numbers, and then pick the numbers at random. The word is random. The word is random. Let's come to systematic sampling with a random start. Other researchers decide to call it systematic sampling. I don't have a problem with that. But others decide to add with a random start to make it, to explain to researchers or prospective researchers how it is operationalized. Here we have what we call a sampling interval. Determine a sampling interval. I'm not supposed to explain this, but for the sake of the class and for us to follow what we are doing with a sampling interval, remember on the other slides we're able to determine a sample size of 385 students out of a frame, which is the total number of students on campus of 10,000. So with a sampling interval, it will be the frame, the total population divided by the sample size. So 10,000 divided by 385, what it gives us will be the sampling interval. And please let me explain this. The sampling interval, it means that if I pick one and the sampling interval is 10, I have to pick the 11th person. So I add 10 to it, I pick the 21st person. That is the sampling interval. That is the sampling interval. But what we do here is that what makes this, somebody will ask, oh, if I'm picking 1 and then I'm skipping 2 to 10 and I'm picking the 11th person, then what makes this probability sampling? What makes it probability sampling is the fact that the initial pick or the first pick is done by random. So what it implies is that much as the first unit can be selected, the 13th unit can also be selected at random. The 15th person can also be selected at random, and that makes it probability sampling. So it's systematic sampling with a random start. We have the stratified sampling. The stratified sampling, strata. It's an English word, strata. Let's have strata. So layers. We have subgroups. So we can have women, we can have men, we can have youth, we can have the elderly. So let's break the population according to some individual identifiable characteristics, and then make sure that we select people from each of the stratum to represent the sample size. So we can say male, female students in KNUST, and then we select units from the male category, female category, and then we do the research. So with a stratified, it can be by any other random approach. It can be systematic random sampling. But the most important thing, or what we are saying, is that we have broken the population into different strata for the research. With a cluster sampling, what we should make sure, what we do is that the researchers decide that we will not be able to cover every other places. So we get just one cluster, having all the units represented. For example, we can decide that, oh, we need a research, but the research should target every Ghanaian. And so that is too expensive. That is too time consuming. We will not be able to cover every Ghanaian. So what do? Let's get a sample. With a sample, then we can say, oh, let's choose the Greater Accra region. With the Greater Accra region, we have almost every tribe being represented. So, sorry. Let's choose the Ashanti region. Every tribe is represented in the Ashanti region. So we choose Ashanti region. Then we select all the units within the Ashanti region to do the research. We're hoping that all the tribes in the Republic of Ghana will be represented in the Ashanti region. And that's cluster sampling. Cluster them and then we do the research. The multi-stage sampling. Multi-stage sampling. We can get the meaning from the word multi-stage sampling. The multi-stage sampling, it's multi-purpose. Several levels. We can't use just one to get our people. For example, we go to an area, we want to get low-income earners. The low-income earners, we don't know how to get them. So first we can say, oh, in Accra, the Accra Metropolitan Assembly has stratified the metropolis into 4 different zones. You have the very low income, the low income, the middle income, and the high income earners. So when you do that, you have adapted the stratified sampling approach. So you have divided them into sections. And you say, oh, fine. We have the communities. So with the communities, let's go. Is everybody here poor? Perhaps no. So what we do is that we also use another sampling method. So we get the units that we need. So we get the units we need. Another example can be, oh, we want to interview some farmers. But the farmers, we go to a district. It's said to be a rural district. People are farming. But we want cocoa farmers. We don't want coffee farmers. We don't want horticultural farmers. We want cocoa farmers. But you will not be able to get them without sieving. So first, you decide to select the farming communities. Then you go down. You select the farmers within the communities. You go down. You select the cocoa farmers. And even we can say, oh, cocoa farmers who have been in operation for 5 or 10 years, because it takes about 5 years for the cocoa to start fruiting. So if you don't do that, you will hardly get the people that you need. So the multi-stage sampling, we have a lot of ties. We apply this, we drop that, we come to this, so we get the units that we need. Under non-probability sampling, we have so many other techniques. We have convenience sampling, quota sampling, purposive sampling, the snowball sampling. Let me walk you through what we have. With a convenience sampling, instead of everybody having an equal chance to be represented in the sample, we decide, oh, we have come to this community, but because of our accessibility problems, let's select households who live very close to the road. When you do that, you have applied non-probability, because any household who lives some miles away from the road is automatically ruled out. So they don't have an equal chance of being represented. Purposive sampling, we can decide to say, oh, I go to you, Amponsa, because Amponsa can answer the questions, and I ignore Maxwell. I come and say, oh, Abeku can answer the question because he's an energy expert, but Owusu cannot do that. So purposely, go and select people you think will be able to do that. So people who will not be able to address your questions will not be considered, and that is purposive sampling. With a snowball sampling, it's often done with units that are very scarce, and then people who are into sometimes illegal businesses or very risky or sensitive issues. For example, prostitutes in a community, in a country that prostitution is not legalized. When it happens this way, you will have to make sure you get one prostitute, and then if he's able to have confidence in what you're doing, she or he will lead you to another prostitute elsewhere. That is the snowball sampling approach. Snowball. So you finish this, he'll take you to another one, you finish it, he will lead you to another person till you exhaust the sample size. With a quota sampling, some call it proportion, sample by proportion. But here we decide that, because women constitute 51% of the Ghanaian population and men 49%, let's select anyhow people from the women category and then people from the men category, but it should be based on 51-49%. But the selection is not done using any probability sampling technique. And so what it means is that some people are ruled out from being represented in the sample. The slide here is telling us the merits and demerits of each of the sampling techniques. But I will leave that to you to read and understand. But I will walk you through the simple random sampling. We say it's highly representative. You all subjects participate. For example, you bring the 10,000 units, you keep them in a basket, you keep them in a box, and you draw the 385. And say we administer. So because we did not have any group in mind, we selected. It makes the research process very representative. Everybody had an equal chance of making it onto the sample. So it makes it representative. But look at the disadvantage. And so what I'm trying to say in effect is that we have to look at the advantages, look at the disadvantages, and then also consider how we can operationalize the sampling techniques within the environment we find ourselves. We say it is not possible without complete list of population numbers. If you come to tell you, KNUST, we are 10,000 students, but we are not able to give you a complete list of the 10,000 students, you can operationalize a simple random sampling because you have to assign numbers to each of the students and then draw them out. So you can't do that. And most often than not, our research works are subject to this limitation. Potentially uneconomical to achieve. Yes. You can select, one of the students that you select will be from the Upper West region. Another will be from the Greater Accra region. And if you have to do the research when school is on the recess, you have to travel to the Upper West region. What if you go and per the address you have been given, he or she is not around? It becomes a non-response. And so it makes it uneconomical. Can be disruptive to isolate members from a group. And then time scale may be too long. These are some of the disadvantages that are leveled against the simple random sampling. All the other approaches have strengths and the weaknesses. And then we will have to, the weaknesses will of course determine how we can operationalize them within the environment we find ourselves. Then after first we have determined the sample size. Then we have also adapted the most appropriate technique in selecting our units. We go to the seventh stage of the survey process, which is the training interviewers. If you will need to interview only 50 students, for example, and the questionnaire is 1.5 pages, sometimes 1 page, you can decide to do that yourself as a researcher. You can decide to do it yourself. So in that case, you may not need to train any interviewers to go and do it, depending on the skill of the survey. But most often than not, the international surveys that we do, the national surveys that we do, require a lot of detailed information. Not only that, so many people will have to be interviewed. So what do? We have to bring a lot of hands on deck for us to be able to finish within a time frame. The UNDP survey that we did, that I keep on referring to, about 30 research assistants. We were supposed to have executed a task by October 2011. The first draft report was submitted on 24th December 2011. Even with all these hands on deck, we were not able to meet the deadline. We had to call for extension for up to the 3rd month before we were able to send the first draft report. So what are we saying? The skill of the research requires that you bring other people on deck, and so there is a need for us to train the interviewers. A successful interview is dependent upon how the interviewer understands the interview skills, and then his understanding or comprehension of the instruments that he's going to administer. If he does not understand that, then garbage in, garbage out. So what we need to do is that we have to train them as to how to ask the questions. So we walk them through the guidelines in conducting an interview. How to ask the questions. How to ensure that the way you are asking the questions do not bias the process. Just to mention a few. And even how to ensure that all the 30 enumerators that you are bringing on board, all of them understand the questions in a similar way, and will also ask the questions in a similar fashion. And then during the training, there are so many plays that are used. He asks somebody to come and act as a respondent, another person come and act as an enumerator, and then do that role play for the audience to also learn lessons from. Be constructively criticize the role that is played, and then we will in effect be able to train our enumerators on how to conduct a successful interview. Now we go to another critical stage of the process: data collection. Data collection. We have determined a sample size. We have agreed on how we will select the units, and then we have trained our enumerators. Now we want to go to the field, collect the data. And what I have here is, it's an important step that must be done right in order to ensure the integrity of the information collected. So what we are trying to say here is that this is also one of the most critical steps in the survey process. If you don't do it right, you will not get the required information that we need. And we go back to the need to settle on the approach to use as one of the stages in the survey process. He said that, should it be done through face-to-face interviews? The data collection, should it be face-to-face interviews? Should it be via telephone service. Can we call them? We talk to them. Should we mail, maybe use the email, or we can mail by post, Ghana Telecom. Can we go and mail to them? We have discussed the pros and cons. With a face-to-face interviews, it's expensive, alright, but it gives you a high response rate. The telephone service, not everybody hasn't telephone, and so though it's inexpensive relative to the face-to-face interviews, you are likely going to get a high level of non-response. Using mail service, some of them will not even get to the destination. Others will take time before you get the responses. But the most serious of all the limitations is the fact that the respondent is not under any obligation, maybe morally or any other, to answer the questions that you are bringing. So it contributes to high non-response rates. The ninth step in the survey process is processing the data. You have conducted a successful data collection exercise, and then you are coming back to process the data. This is also a very important stage in the survey process. Take it from me. If you don't do the right processing, you may not be able to gather the responses to answering your research questions. So what we often do is we code the responses and then we enter the data. But if you had used the structured questionnaires in gathering the responses that you needed, remember that with the structured questionnaires, the responses are already coded. And so you can even decide if you are using SPSS, if you are using CSPRO, the Census Processing System, if you are using Stata, you are even using a common Excel, you can design a template before you go to the field. In the Unit 4, Mr. Fazer will explain in detail how you can use the SPSS, for example, to help you analyze your quantitative data. But what I'm saying is that if it is structured, you can design your variable view. You can even go ahead to design, you design a variable view, the responses that you get from the field, you enter, and then you will be able to generate the statistics that you need for your analysis. Before I touch on the 10th stage, even at the 9th stage, some people or some researchers decide to enter the responses that we get from the field differently by two different people or several times. So the first attempt, for example, will be come and enter the data that we gathered from the field, and then we ask another person to come take the same instrument and enter. So that is double entry. Sometimes we can even get a third party to come and enter, and then we compare the responses. The reason is that some of the errors can be a human error. What we most often do out of experience is, we pay you based on the number of questionnaires you are able to enter. So everybody who comes on board wants to enter as many questions as possible. And that always compromises quality. So if you have another person checking, though it's expensive, time consuming, the credibility of the research process is not compromised upon. And that's a rule of thumb. So we tend to do that in the surveys that we do. The 10th stage is analysis of the results. How do we analyze the results? Remember, we've coded the responses. We've entered into, for example, the SPSS. SPSS is Statistical Package for Social Sciences. We've entered into the SPSS. We want to generate the results. we generate the results with the SPSS with the starter. And I rest my case here because Mr. Fazer will explain SPSS, will explain starter, how you can use it to generate your figures. But the SPSS aside that, if any of the tools you want to use, for example, you want to do multiple regression as a multivariate analysis, you can easily use it to generate the data that you want. If you want to use linear regression, you can do it. If you even want to test hypotheses, the SPSS, these softwares can help you do that. So it's a matter of just interpreting the results that are generated by the figures. But this, we have to understand, this stage, it's informed by the other stages that we have talked about. Most importantly, the data entry. If you don't enter the right data, then the results we will get, the interpretation of the results will also not be right. Please, let's have that understanding. And then interpret and disseminate the results. So the SPSS has been able to generate the figures for you. 20% of them use LPG, but 79% of them use biofuels. So what is the implication, for example, on the environment? What is the implication of the energy that is used on ecological sustainability? Why are people much inclined to the use of biofuels at the expense of the modern forms of cooking fuels? Then the write-up, you will interpret the results that we get, and then you disseminate. The dissemination can be done at several levels. The Energy Center did a survey for the World Bank. As a matter of fact, it was a scoping study for the World Bank, and it was done in 3 slum communities. The intention of the researchers, after the report has been accepted by the World Bank, is to disseminate the results. And in come June, it is proposed that come June, a stakeholder meeting will be held in Accra to disseminate the results so that policy actions can be taken to include the urban slum dweller into the planning process. So there are so many ways we can disseminate the results. But remember that as research, one of the reasons why we undertake a research is to contribute to knowledge. So if you are not ready to contribute to knowledge, if you are not ready to disseminate our results, then how do we contribute to knowledge? Others disseminate the results through publications. I did a research in 2008 about the effects of the frequent and unannounced electricity blackouts on the operations of micro and small-scale enterprises in the Kumasi metropolis. The results have been disseminated in the Journal of Sustainable Development. So please, we have so many ways of disseminating our results. The last step is to take action. Most of the researches we do, I'm a planner, a development planner. Most of the researches we do in development planning starts off by identifying a problem, and then we end with recommendations aimed at addressing the problems. A lot of research works that I've also come across also do the same thing. They end with recommendations, what we should do. So taking action implies what action we should take to implement the recommendations that have been made. In the Energy Center survey in the slums, it is recommended that there should be technical and economic viability analysis of the biogas potentials of the slums, so that they could supply gas for cooking as cooking fuel. So any action that we take to practicalize or to operationalizing this recommendation, it's part of the survey process, the 12th stage, take action. Now remember that just as there is a need to clarify the purpose of the research in the survey research, and then it's also an approach that is used in other disciplines, so do the other research works also take action. If there are recommendations, there is a need to take action to implement the recommendations to address the research objectives, or maybe to address the problem that you identify. We go on to the second stage. But we go on to another research approach that is used in the social science, the case study research. Let's get the difference. With a survey research, some of the data that we get may be qualitative, but we say that it's largely quantitative. In a case study, it's largely qualitative because we need an in-depth understanding of the subject under investigation. An in-depth understanding. So we have to sit down with the subject, understand everything. So what we say is that the survey research, the case study research is to explain why people behave in a certain manner. So why people behave in a certain manner. And then we can do that after studying them in detail. We tend to do that with some interview guides. We'll be guided by the interviews. And then we write almost everything that our respondent says. That is a case study. And it's different from the survey research. So let's consider the purpose of the case study. And I said that is to determine factors factors that have resulted in the behavior under study. The behavior, the phenomena that we are studying. What factors are accounting for that? And we have to get a selected few, devote much attention to, and understand them. The intention is not to tell us 20% of them behave this way, but they behave this way because of that. The investigation involves a detailed examination of a single subject. It can be one person. You can come to me, use a case study approach, and interview only me, and it's acceptable. You can also decide to select a group. We have a lot of political parties. You select one political party, one group in a community, and interview them. You can also decide to select a phenomenon, and interview them. That is a case study, and it's acceptable. Unlike the survey research, that we have to get a population, and then we make sure that the sample that we come up with is representative. With the case study, it's not about the representativeness of the sample, but rather the units that you are understanding, the extent to which you will get the detailed information, so that you will be able to explain why people behave in a certain manner. Let's look at some of the techniques for the selection of cases in case studies. The cases in case studies. The cases can be one group or an individual. An individual is a case. The group is a case. We can decide to select just about 2 cases. They are all cases that we are selecting in a case study. So please, let's get that. Case selection in a case study research has similar objectives as some random sampling. Similar objectives. The intention with a random sampling is that we want to ensure that everybody, the sample represents the entire population. So where we need to make a generalization in a case study, we need to make sure that the case that we select, the findings we will get will be enough for us to represent, to generalize for other cases. For example, in Ghana, we select one political party, and then we devote our resources, attention, to understand why some political parties behave a certain manner. Then we expect that the findings we get here will be used to represent the cases from the other political parties. So in that case, what we should make sure we do is that the case is representative of the others. But in a survey research, we will say, oh, let's make sure that we get units from each of the political parties for the research. But here, we devote attention to just one political party or some few political parties. Not interested so much about the numbers, but rather the subjects that we are investigating. And in case selection, a researcher desires a representative sample which has useful variation on the dimensions of theoretical interest, and that is what I've just explained. One's choice of cases is therefore driven by the way a case is situated along these dimensions. Why do we select political part A? The political part A that we selected showed be such that we can represent the other political parties. But the other thing that we look out for is that sometimes cases we will not be able to think of generalizing because they have some uniqueness. For example, in Ghana in the 1983s, there was a drought. And then there is this popular saying that all those who were born in those years are stunted because they were malnourished. If you want to investigate that, and they also have a certain behavioral pattern, if you want to investigate that, you get people who were born in 1983 and you do that study. How can you replicate that? You may not be able to replicate that. So in that case, we can get just one and then compare our findings with other research works on the same subject matter done elsewhere, so that we will be able to generalize our findings. But how do we collect the information? Remember, this time we need an in-depth knowledge of the subject we are investigating. And then because it's largely qualitative, we go with interview guides. Sometimes we organize focus group discussions. They are purely qualitative approaches that we use. Other researchers argue that even with a case study approach, we can complement the qualitative method with some quantitative approaches. Accepted. But the point is that with a case study approach, we are very much interested in the factors shaping a behavioral pattern of the subject we are investigating. And in that case, we leave no stone unturned. We explain in detail. That's why Kumeko 2006 argues that the case study research is most relevant for a contemporary research that suffers from time. That is, we don't have enough time to be able to cover a lot of units. So let's concentrate the little time, the little resource we have on one case, hoping that the findings we'll get will be enough to represent the other units that were not represented. The last part of the lecture I want to discuss is that the video I showed, do we need to do we need to observe some ethics in research? In the video, they are testing an aircraft, aircraft, we need to test it and see if it will work before we will then invest on a large scale in producing or manufacturing such aircraft. And that is done by you engineers, by you the natural scientists. But those of us in the social sciences, because we don't have these models to represent the reality, we tend to be very much concerned about what we call research ethics. The first is what we call informed consent. Informed consent. The respondent should be ready to grant the interview. What we have come to accept as an international best practice is for you to go to the respondent with an extra form titled informed consent. Some call it consent form. And then the respondent will indicate his readiness to answer the research instrument. So that the evidence will be the signature. Sometimes if it's not able to, because of low illiteracy level, it's not able to sign, we ask him to thumbprint, or we ask the respondent to thumbprint. If he does that, then anybody will say, oh, the respondent was not coerced to answer the responses. So we can say that you have followed one of the ethics in research. So what we're doing is that we don't have to force them against their will to answer our questions. If we force them, because we are not the first researchers, they are likely going to influence or bias what we are going to do. The other thing is competence. Competence. Competence is the one that you are interviewing should be competent, should be well placed to answer the questions. You come to a household, the household head, the spouse, they are not there, and you decide to interview a child about the household income. That it's not correct. The child doesn't have the competence to be able to address that. So what we do most often is that the researcher, the household head, for example, will be able to give you income information. But when it comes to the expenditure, because the money is always given to the wife to cook and to buy several other things, the wife knows how much indeed is spent on certain food items. So with the competence, the wife is brought on board to answer some of the questions we ask. How much, for example, do you spend on charcoal? How much do you spend on pepper? How much do you spend on other spices? If you force the man to tell you the answer, he may conjecture, he may speculate, and that may not be true. So we can get the woman to come and support. If it is the woman's responsibility, of course, the gender roles that we play. If it's the woman's responsibility, then she can come and support us with the information we need. Another very important thing that we need to observe in the research, especially in the social sciences, is privacy. Privacy. People will grant the interviews if they think that, if they believe strongly that whatever information they give out will be between you and him. And then the sensitivity of the information is one of the things that we have to consider. If it's about somebody's HIV status, if it's about somebody's income and expenditure, it's very sensitive. So to safeguard the person, we ensure that the instruments guarantee their anonymity. What do I mean? We don't write names of the respondent on the questionnaire. But sometimes because of the need to make follow-ups, we decide to take down their names and telephone numbers so that we can call them. But we have to make sure that the information that we gather, it's not even analyzed along the names that we have. If we do that, we are compromising privacy, and it's against the ethics in research. We also have to look at the setting. We have to look at the private areas. For example, if you're asking somebody the number of times he sleeps with the husband or the wife, as we did in the Millennium Villages project, the number of times he sleeps with the wife in a week. In our parts of the world, in the developing part of the world, it is said to be a very sensitive issue that is not even made public. So if you make it public, it's something you are seen to even be a deviant. So how do you get responses for issues like this? And then what you need to do is to ensure that a setting guarantees privacy. I'm in a room alone and I'm speaking. So if somebody were here interviewing me, I can, of course, if that I have confidence in the survey that he's doing, I can give him a lot of information. So we have to consider the setting. The moment the other people intrude, you will have to excuse them and then ensure that the privacy is maintained. Of course, if you are investigating sensitive issues. Even what makes it this very, very important is the fact that sometimes when other intruders come, they will rather be answering the questions based on what they have, and then they will compromise the research process. We also look at dissemination of the information. Do we disseminate the information by linking, for example, this man, he says that he likes to walk to work, but he doesn't want to ride in a vehicle. Do we have to say that Amponsan says that he doesn't like this, but he likes that? No, if you do that, you are compromising the ethics in research. So what you need to do is to do the analysis without the person's personality attached to it. If you do that, then you are ensuring that the anonymity is protected. If you don't do that, there will come a time, some responses, they fear that you go and say, oh, they said this, they said that. Meanwhile, the entire community members are saying they need perhaps water. And then you will say, no, it's not water that we need this. And you are able to argue very well, strongly, that we don't need water, but they need another option. If the other option is implemented and not the water, and the analysis was not done properly, the analysis was not done to safeguard the anonymity of the person, then the community members will be pointing accusing fingers at me. So it comes to the anonymity and confidentiality. It has to be protected. And so what our students have been doing, and as would-be researchers, what they do is that they tell you the information that I'm gathering will be treated with a deserving confidentiality. I'm picking out a report to show to you viewers. This is a first degree special study being undertaken by one of the candidates in the Department of Planning. And this is the instrument she designed. The preamble, it reads, this questionnaire is to seek relevant information for the conduct of an academic exercise on the topic, the role of the home finance company in housing provision in the Kumasi metropolis, towards the award of bachelor's degree in development planning from the Department of Planning. Your support and cooperation is very much anticipated, since data collected will be treated with absolute confidentiality. Absolute confidentiality. This is somebody who's aspiring for a first degree. And so what I'm trying to say is that anonymity and confidentiality is something we should all be aspiring for in our research, for our work to be sustainable. So after having talked about the ethics that we need to observe in the research and ensuring this as one of the evidence, I sum up the session with this. Research in the social science deals directly with a human being. And to put this in a different way, I will say that the society is the laboratory of social research, or research in the social sciences. And whilst we have a physical laboratory used by the natural sciences, and then several approaches can be used to investigate a subject or can be used to investigate a phenomenon in the social sciences. But what we need to do is to clarify the purpose of the research that we are doing, and then look into the various approaches that we have. Look at which one best suits the research that we want to do. Is it a case study? Is it a survey research? Is it a classical experimental research design? Is it a descriptive study? Is it an exploratory study? There are so many other research approaches that we can use. So as I have here, the onus, it's on the researcher to use the most appropriate method. And it's also equally important to observe the code of ethics or the research ethics to be able to safeguard the integrity of the research process. Thank you very much for your time.